The Adriatic Sea shimmered like glass beneath a pale morning sun, its calm surface belying the turmoil that rippled unseen across its depths. It was 1915, and while the great battles of Europe thundered across fields and trenches, here the war felt distant, quieter, more uncertain. The front was a scattered thing, fishing villages turned outposts, naval bases hidden in coves, and skies watched as much by seagulls as by sentries. Across this narrow strip of water, Italy faced the Austro-Hungarian Empire, two nations divided by ambition and joined by the same sea. The Adriatic, once a merchant's route and a poet's muse, had become a boundary of suspicion. In its air hung the mingled scents of salt, oil, and smoke from distant ships. Small patrol boats traced restless paths along the horizon, their crews peering into the haze for shapes that might be friend or foe. Overhead, the sky was both theatre and mystery. It carried the promise of something new. A war fought not just across land and sea, but through air. The first fragile aircraft appeared like ghosts, drifting above the waves, their engines coughing against the wind. They were few, uncertain, and often lost to storms or enemy fire before ever being seen. Yet their presence changed everything. This was no longer a war of trenches and mud. It was a war over movement, over the unseen. And though the Adriatic might have seemed quiet compared to the fields of France, its silence was deceptive. Beneath that blue expanse, nations waited, watching the sky for what would come next. Wings over a broken sea. They were young, most of them barely old enough to shave, and yet they believed they could master the sky. The Italian Air Service in 1915 was a patchwork of ambition and improvisation, engineers with grease under their nails, poets turned pilots, mechanics who learned to pray by listening to engines. They built their planes in sheds that smelled of pine and varnish, the canvas wings stretched by hand, each stitch a small act of faith. Their uniforms were often mismatched, their maps uncertain, their mission undefined, but their eyes were bright, fixed on the limitless promise above the sea. To fly in those days was both madness and miracle. The engines roared and sputtered, the propellers blurred like halos, and the air vibrated with risk. These pilots carried no illusions of glory. They wrote letters home, not about victories, but about clouds, sunlight, and the strange stillness one felt above the world's noise. They were Italy's dreamers of the sky, men who believed that flight itself could redeem the ugliness of war. When they took off from coastal fields, the land fell away beneath them, and for a moment they were free. Beyond politics, beyond fear, balanced between heaven and history. Yet below the Adriatic waited, vast and indifferent, ready to claim the fallen. Their courage was as fragile as the planes they flew, but their hope was stronger still. In that blend of youth, invention, and danger, a new kind of warfare and a new kind of humanity was just beginning to take shape. In Vienna, confidence floated as easily as the smoke from officers' cigars. The Austro-Hungarian command, seated in its marble halls and polished war rooms, believed the Adriatic to be theirs by right and by reason. Their fleet was vast, their coastal guns precise, their airships a marvel of engineering. Admirals spoke of Italy's entry into the war with a faint smile, as though amused by a younger brother's reckless ambition. "They have courage," one general quipped, "but courage does not fly." Maps of the Adriatic lay spread across ornate tables, dotted with neat blue symbols that marked the empire's dominance. From Trieste to Pola, their bases gleamed with order and discipline. The empire's pilots, trained, uniformed, and confident, soared above the sea with the pride of men defending a dynasty that had lasted centuries. They mocked the Italian flyers who dared to cross their waters in fragile wooden frames, calling them paper birds destined to fall. Vienna's salons echoed with laughter and string quartets, While beyond the laughter, few noticed how fast the world was changing. The Empire mistook elegance for strength, mistook machinery for mastery. In that self-assurance lay the first cracks, invisible, spreading quietly beneath the surface. For while the Austrians believed themselves unshakable, somewhere across the sea, Italian mechanics were learning faster than anyone expected. They were building not just machines, but a kind of belief that could not be measured on a map. The Empire's laughter would not last long. Even marble trembles when the air begins to move. For the Italians, the war in the sky began as a series of heartbreaks. Engines stalled mid-air, wings tore in gusts, and propellers splintered like kindling. Their aircraft were delicate things, patchwork machines born of scarcity and hope. Flights often ended in the sea, their pilots rescued half-frozen or not at all. Reports told of men vanishing into clouds and never returning. Mechanics worked with trembling hands, cursing the lack of fuel tools and proper parts. Every flight was a test of faith, in the machine, in luck, in the meaning of the struggle itself. Yet failure bred a fierce kind of intimacy. Pilots and crews became brothers, bound not by victory but by endurance. They joked about death with a weary humor, their laughter thin but defiant. When an engine roared to life, it was like a heartbeat returning to a dying patient. Each successful takeoff felt like rebellion against the odds. The Austrians mocked them from the safety of their hangars, but the Italians had something more potent than perfection. They had imagination. Slowly, painfully, they learned. They adjusted wings for balance, strengthened fuselages with wire, studied wind like scholars studying scripture. Their planes remained crude, but their courage refined itself with every loss. What began as clumsy attempts became experiments in survival, each flight a question posed to fate. And though the Adriatic swallowed many of their answers, something was shifting in the air, the rhythm of persistence, the quiet promise that failure itself could teach men to fly. On the quiet shores of Lake Varese, far from the thunder of artillery, a man named Carlo Macchi listened to the hum of wind over water and imagined wings. Before the war, he had been a builder of boats, a craftsman who understood how wood could bend and float, how balance and beauty belonged to function. When Italy called its sons to arms, Macchi answered not with a rifle, but with tools. His workshop, once filled with the scent of varnish and cedar, now echoed with the sharper smell of oil and metal. There, surrounded by artisans and dreamers, he began to reimagine flight itself. The air over the Adriatic was ruled by Austrian machines, heavier and faster than anything Italy could produce. But Macchi saw possibility in what others dismissed as fragility. He believed that a plane could rise from water, dance across its surface, and fight with the grace of a gull. Each morning, mist curled over the lake as his team hammered, measured, and carved. The sound of saws mingled with birdsong, the line between nature and invention blurring. Macchi's genius lay not in power, but in harmony, the way he married wood and canvas into something alive. His engineers called him the poet of the workshop, and though his hands were rough, his vision was delicate. He worked not to conquer, but to create movement. In a war built on destruction, he sought balance. And on that still lake, amid the hum of creation, the outline of a new kind of aircraft began to form, a seaplane that could rise, fight, and return home upon the same water that gave it birth. The first sketches of what would become the Macchi M.5 looked impossibly fragile. Pencil lines tracing the curve of wings, the buoyant hull, the twin struts that would lift it from the surface of the lake. But to Macchi, every line sang with potential. He envisioned an aircraft that could defend Italy's coasts and challenge the Austrian airships that dominated the Adriatic. The challenge was immense, a plane that must float, take off from water, fight in the air, and land again safely. It had to be light, strong, and balanced, a contradiction of materials and dreams. His team experimented endlessly. They tested hulls that cracked, propellers that splintered, engines that sputtered and died. Yet each failure refined the next attempt. The workshop became a symphony of persistence, sandpaper against wood, the hiss of steam, the metallic heartbeat of engines coming alive. When at last the prototype took shape, its fuselage gleamed like polished amber, the grain of its wood visible beneath the lacquer. Mechanics watched as it slid into the lake for its first test, sunlight catching the ripples around its wings. The engine coughed, then steadied, and the machine began to move, first a glide, then a lift, then flight. It rose from the water like a secret finally spoken aloud. Those who saw it that day swore they felt something shift, not just in aviation, but in spirit. The Macchi M.5 was born, and with it, the fragile dream of turning beauty into defense and craft into courage. The morning air above Lake Varese trembled with anticipation. Mechanics wiped their hands on oil-stained cloths, their eyes fixed on the small wooden craft, rocking gently on the water. It was delicate. Too delicate, some thought. Its wings stretched tight as silk, its float gleaming in the soft light. Carlo Macchi stood by the shore, silent, his hat in his hands, his breath held as if a prayer might disturb the stillness. The pilot, face pale but calm, climbed into the open cockpit and checked the instruments. A compass, a few dials, little more. The engine sputtered, coughed, then caught, filling the air with a sound that was more heartbeat than machine. Ripples spread across the lake as the propeller stirred the morning mist into ribbons of silver. Slowly, the craft began to move, skipping across the water's surface like a stone that refused to sink. Then came the moment, brief, breathless, when the resistance vanished. The floats lifted free and the plane rose. Gasps broke the silence as it climbed, fragile yet sure, its reflection chasing it across the mirrored surface below. The engine's song grew steadier, its rhythm blending with the wind. For those watching, it was as if gravity itself had paused to watch this defiance. The pilot banked once, twice, then descended, landing in a plume of spray so graceful it seemed rehearsed by nature. When the engine fell silent, the only sound was applause, quiet, reverent, the sound of disbelief turning into belief. Word of the flight spread faster than wind over water. Within days, skeptics and officials arrived to see for themselves. Naval officers, engineers, journalists with pens ready to record failure. They expected a brief struggle, perhaps a crash, something to confirm their doubts. What they saw instead stole their words. The Macchi M.5 slid across the lake's surface, lifted cleanly into the air, and wheeled over them with elegance that no machine of war had ever shown. Spray glittered like diamonds in its wake. Against the blue of the sky, the seaplane looked alive, half bird, half miracle. The engine roared confidently, its echo bouncing between the surrounding hills. As it swooped low over the water, the crowd ducked instinctively, laughter giving way to awe. Even the most skeptical officers could not hide their admiration. They saw precision, balance, grace, and above all, possibility. The machine that had once seemed absurd now looked inevitable. Reporters scribbled furiously, describing it as the moment Italy learned to fly from water. Macchi, standing at the edge of the lake, said little. He only smiled, his eyes following the path of the plane as it arced against the sun. For him, it was never about victory or pride. It was about proving that imagination could become motion. As the M5 landed and taxied back toward the shore, droplets sparkled around it like applause made visible. The laughter that had once echoed in Vienna was gone now, replaced by silence. The silence that comes when a dream finally takes flight. The Adriatic glimmered like a field of shattered glass beneath the morning sun, every wave crest flashing white against the blue. From above came the hum of engines, not one but several, weaving sound into tension. The first dogfights over the sea had begun. Italian M5s, their hulls slicing through spray as they lifted from the water, met Austrian flying boats descending from the haze beyond the horizon. The air shimmered with heat and motion. Machine guns cracked in brief, disciplined bursts, their echoes scattering over the waves like pebbles thrown into a pond. From a distance, it looked almost graceful, a dance of machines tracing circles in the sky. One M5 climbed sharply, sunlight glinting off its wings, then rolled, diving behind its target in a smooth, fluid motion that defied logic. Bullets stitched the air, and a plume of smoke blossomed from an Austrian fuselage. The wounded aircraft spiraled downward, striking the sea with a burst of steam and flame that quickly dissolved into ripples. Yet there was no triumph in the faces of those who fought. Each maneuver demanded calm precision, each victory carried a trace of sorrow. Beneath them lay the endless sea, indifferent, patient, swallowing all noise. The pilots learned to move not as warriors, but as dancers suspended between life and the water's cold certainty. When they landed, salt dried on their goggles and oil streaked their faces, but their eyes still carried that faraway look, as if they'd seen both beauty and terror suspended in the same sky. The Adriatic had become their stage and their graveyard, a place where courage was measured not by survival, but by the elegance of defiance. Names began to emerge from the foam and smoke. Luigi Bologna, the quiet strategist whose calm under fire inspired the others. Charles Rastelli, whose daring turns seemed choreographed by instinct alone. They were young, barely older than the planes they flew, yet they carried themselves with the stillness of men who had already faced the edge of existence. Bologna was known for his silence after combat, staring long into the sea as if reading its secrets. Rastelli laughed easily on the ground, but in the air he became something else, focused, serene, his movements almost tender as he guided the M5 through gunfire and gusts. They did not call themselves heroes. They were craftsmen of survival, sculptors of air. Their victories lifted morale far beyond the coast. Newspapers in Rome and Milan spoke of them as if they were myths, taking shape above the waves. Mothers pinned newspaper clippings beside fading portraits of sons lost at sea. For a brief moment, Italy, battered, weary, uncertain, looked upward and believed in grace again. Yet even as the legends grew, the men themselves remained small against the vastness of what they faced. Their laughter between missions was soft, their gestures humble. They knew that the sea would take them one day, just as it took everything. But until then, they would keep flying, tracing arcs of courage across the sky, fleeting lines that vanished in sunlight, yet lingered forever in the memory of those who watched. In Vienna's high-ceilinged war rooms, where brass fixtures gleamed under chandeliers and maps stretched like fading promises across the walls, the mood had changed. The laughter that once greeted reports of Italian seaplane experiments was gone, replaced by a silence weighted with disbelief. Telegrams from the Adriatic arrived hourly, terse, precise, undeniable. Italian pilots, once dismissed as amateurs, were now claiming victories with increasing regularity. The M5, that fragile creation of wood, wire, and will, had proven itself faster, more agile, more alive than anything the Austrians had sent against it. Generals bent over reconnaissance photos, tracing flight paths with gloved fingers, murmuring quietly. Pride was a uniform they had worn too long, and now it itched. One admiral, who had once declared that Italians belonged in gondolas, not cockpits, stared at a blurred image of an M5 banking above the sea and said nothing. Outside, autumn rain pattered against marble steps, a rhythm of inevitability. The empire, built on confidence and ceremony, was learning humility from the very nation it had sought to belittle. Reports described Italian formations moving with precision, coordination, and almost poetic daring. It was not chaos that defined them now, but grace. In private, younger officers whispered admiration. They spoke of the elegance of the Italian machines, of the bravery in facing superior numbers. The enemy had become a teacher, forcing the empire to see the future it had refused to imagine. Vienna's pride did not shatter. It softened, reshaped by truth. And in that quiet recognition, a strange respect began to form, the kind that only comes when mockery turns to awe. The sky above the Adriatic no longer belonged to one side. It had become a mirror, reflecting the courage of all who dared to rise into it. By 1918, the war above the Adriatic had taken on a different tone, less about dominance, more about endurance. Pilots who once hunted each other now shared, unknowingly, the same reverence for the air they cut through and the sea that waited below. Italian and Austrian aviators began to sense an unspoken fraternity, bound by the elements that threatened them both. Stories filtered through prisoner exchanges, of wounded pilots treated by their enemies, of notes dropped over enemy airfields. In tribute after a daring fight, Charles Rastelli was once trailed across the sky by an Austrian ace known only as the Falcon of Pola. They duelled 3 times in as many weeks, each time surviving, each time saluting with a wing tilt before turning for home. By the 4th encounter, both hesitated, circled, and then drifted apart without firing a shot. Such moments were small rebellions against the machinery of hatred, gestures of weary honor amid exhaustion. Vienna's newspapers began to write with a different voice, still proud, but tinged with admiration. They spoke of worthy adversaries, of Italians who had mastered the sea's reflection. The war had forced recognition that courage was not a possession of empire, but a quality shared by those who flew. As the Adriatic's waves shimmered below, both sides understood. Progress had made them rivals, but survival had made them kin. The laughter was gone now, replaced by silence, not of defeat, but of mutual respect. When the guns fell silent, and the war retreated into memory, the Macchi M.5 remained, not as a relic, but as a symbol. Its elegant frame, once born from desperation, became a foundation for everything that followed in Italian aviation. Engineers who had studied its lines, its balance between strength and fragility, carried those lessons into the next generation of aircraft, into the roaring biplanes of the 1920s, and eventually into the sleek fighters that would define Italy's air identity for decades. Museums would later polish its wooden frame until it gleamed like amber, suspended above polished floors, wings stretched as if ready to lift once more. For the pilots who had flown it, the M5 was more than a machine. It was a companion, responsive, unpredictable, alive. They spoke of how it seemed to sense the air, how its wings flexed like muscle when turning through sea mist. To fly it was to feel every vibration of the engine as a heartbeat, every gust as a whisper. Those who survived long enough to see peace carried that sensation for life. The mingled fear and freedom that only the open sky could offer. And across Italy, the M5 became part of the nation's quiet mythology, proof that ingenuity could rise from scarcity, that beauty could emerge from war's grey shadow. In its curved hull and slender wings, the country found both memory and meaning, a reminder that flight was never just about machines, but about the stubborn will to rise above the ruins. Years passed, and the Adriatic returned to calm. Blue, endless, unchanged. Yet, for those who remembered, its horizon still shimmered with unseen echoes, engines humming faintly in memory, sunlight flickering on phantom wings. The war had taken much, but it had given something too, the understanding that even destruction could give birth to wonder. Progress marched on, relentless and brilliant. Airframes of steel replaced wood, engines roared louder, and skies, once intimate, became theatres of power. Yet the essence remained unchanged, the human urge to master the air, to carve meaning into motion. The Macchi M.5, with its hand-shaped curves and trembling courage, had begun that story for Italy. Its legacy was not in victories recorded or enemies downed, but in the spirit it awakened, the belief that art and innovation could coexist. Even in times of despair, as historians looked back, they spoke less of the battles and more of the beauty found within them, a beauty born of effort, sacrifice, and fleeting grace. In that reflection, the war became not a tale of machines, but of the souls who built and flew them. The sky itself seemed to hold their memory, forgiving yet eternal, its vastness absorbing the lessons of both pride and humility. At dusk, when the light bends low over the Adriatic, one can almost imagine the faint silhouette of an M5 skimming the water, a ghost of invention gliding between worlds. It reminds us that history, like flight, is sustained by balance between destruction and creation, between sorrow and hope. And somewhere in that balance, humanity finds its wings again.